Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe dignity and justice still matter, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Grace Ellis, the woman everyone in that bar thought was invisible. Grace Ellis moved through the Black Saint like a shadow. Her black uniform was plain. Her shoes were worn at the edges. Her hands smelled faintly of lemon soap and old whiskey. Every night, she wiped marble tables that cost more than her rent, carried crystal glasses for men who never said thank you, and lowered her eyes whenever powerful voices filled the room. That was how she survived. In that bar, survival meant silence. The Black Saint sat beneath the Moretti Hotel, hidden behind a brass door with no sign. Upstairs, rich tourists slept on silk sheets. Downstairs, senators, judges, businessmen, and men with bloodless smiles made deals under amber light. And at the center table, beneath the largest chandelier, sat Dante Moretti. He did not laugh with the others. He did not need to. Dante Moretti was the kind of man whose silence could quiet a room faster than a gunshot. His black suit was tailored perfectly across broad shoulders. His dark hair was brushed back. His face looked carved from cold stone, handsome in a way that felt dangerous rather than warm. On his right sat Victor Hale, his oldest advisor. Victor was polished, silver-haired, and cruel in the casual way of men who had never paid for their cruelty. He wore a navy suit, a gold watch, and a ring Grace had noticed the moment he entered. That ring had kept her awake for 3 nights. Because she had seen it before. Not on Victor's hand. On a photograph buried inside her father's old evidence box. Grace kept her breathing steady as she crossed the floor with a tray of clean glasses. The jazz band played softly near the far wall. Laughter rose from the VIP table, smooth and expensive. Then someone's elbow struck her tray. One glass slipped. It shattered against the marble. The music seemed to dip. Every head turned. Grace froze, then quickly crouched to gather the broken pieces. Victor leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Careful, girl," he said, loud enough for the table to hear. "That floor is worth more than your whole life." A few men chuckled. Grace kept her eyes down. Her fingers touched a shard of glass, but she did not flinch. Pain was nothing new. Humiliation was nothing new. What hurt was the familiar way the room accepted it, as if her dignity had always belonged beneath their shoes. Dante lifted his whiskey glass, but did not drink. His eyes moved from Victor to Grace. Victor noticed. "People like her hear things, Dante," he said, still smiling. "You should keep the help away from real conversations." Grace stood slowly. For 1 second, her eyes met Victor's. And in that second, she knew. The ring. The voice from the tape. The name her father had whispered before his reputation was destroyed. Victor Hale had not just betrayed Dante Moretti. He had helped bury the truth about Dante's brother. Grace turned toward the bar, heart pounding beneath her uniform. In her apron pocket, folded twice, was a small white note she had written in the staff restroom with trembling hands. 7 words. Enough to save a life. Enough to end hers. She waited until the bartender looked away. Then she picked up a clean napkin, crossed behind Dante's chair, and wiped a circle of spilled whiskey near his glass. No one watched the maid. That was their mistake. As she straightened, Grace slid the folded note beneath Dante Moretti's glass. Then she stepped back into the shadows. Dante's hand reached for the whiskey. The glass shifted. The note appeared. He unfolded it with 2 fingers. "Don't drink. The man beside you killed your brother." Dante did not move. The room kept laughing. But his world had already stopped. Dante Moretti read the note once. Then again. 7 words to N.O. signature, N.O. explanation. Only a warning sharp enough to cut through 20 years of buried grief. "Don't drink. The man beside you killed your brother." For a long second, nothing in his face changed. The jazz band kept playing near the back wall. Ice clicked inside crystal glasses. Somewhere, a woman laughed too loudly, unaware that the temperature in the room had just dropped. Dante's fingers rested beside the whiskey, not on the glass. Beside it, Victor Hale noticed the pause. "You all right, Dante?" he asked, his smile easy, practiced. "You look like you just remembered a ghost." Dante folded the note slowly, hiding it inside his palm. "A ghost," he said quietly. "That's one word for it." Victor chuckled, but his eyes sharpened. Across the room, Grace Ellis stood near the service station with a stack of clean napkins in her hands. She tried to look busy, tried to look invisible again. But once a person has stepped out of silence, invisibility never fits the same way. Her pulse beat so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had done it. She had warned him. Now came the part she feared most. Would he believe her? Dante lifted his glass at last. Grace's breath caught. Victor leaned back, watching. The men around the table continued their conversation about shipping contracts and political favors, but Victor's gaze stayed fixed on Dante's hand. Too fixed. Too hungry. Dante raised the whiskey halfway to his lips, then stopped. He looked at the amber liquid as though it had whispered something back to him. Victor, he said. Yes. How long have you been with my family? The question seemed harmless, almost nostalgic. Victor smiled wider. Since your father still had black hair. 30 years, give or take. And my brother trusted you. The table quieted slightly. Victor's smile flickered. Luca trusted everyone, he said. That was his weakness. Dante finally looked at him. No anger. No shouting. Just a stillness so complete it made the nearest bodyguard straighten. My brother's weakness, Dante said, was believing betrayal always came from enemies. The words landed softly, but Grace saw Victor's hand tighten around his glass. There it was. The crack. Small, almost invisible, but real. Grace remembered the tape in her tiny apartment above the laundromat. Her father's voice rough from exhaustion. The sound of him saying Victor Hale's name like a man reading his own death sentence. She had found the box 3 weeks ago, hidden behind a loose panel in her mother's old closet. Inside were photographs, receipts, a silver lighter engraved with the Moretti crest, and one cassette labeled in her father's handwriting, for Dante Moretti, if I don't make it. Her father had not made it. The city had called him corrupt. The papers had called him a disgrace. Men in suits had stood over his name and buried it under lies. Grace had been 16 then, old enough to understand shame, too young to fight it. Now, 10 years later, she was standing in the one room where his truth could finally breathe. Dante set the whiskey down untouched. Victor laughed once, low and thin. You're in a strange mood tonight. No, Dante said. For the first time in years, I think I'm in the right mood. He turned his head slightly. Grace. Her name crossed the room like a match struck in darkness. Every face turned toward her. The bartender froze with a towel in his hand. The waitress near the kitchen door stopped mid-step. Even the pianist missed one note before recovering. Victor blinked. You know the maid's name? Dante did not look away from Grace. Come here. Grace's legs felt heavy, but she moved. Step by step. Past the men who had laughed at her. Past the broken glass she had not finished cleaning. Past Victor Hale, whose smile had now disappeared completely. When she reached the table, Dante held up the folded note between 2 fingers. Did you write this? The room tightened around her. Grace could lie. She could shake her head, apologize, pretend she knew nothing. She could return to the shadows and maybe survive the night. But then she thought of her father. His badge in a dusty box. His name spat on by strangers. His grave visited by almost no one. Grace lifted her chin. Yes, Mr. Moretti, she said. I wrote it. Victor stood so quickly his chair scraped against the marble. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You're taking accusations from cleaning staff now? Dante's eyes stayed on Grace. Why? Grace reached into her apron pocket. Her fingers closed around the old cassette tape. Because my father died trying to tell you the truth. The room went silent. Victor Hale's face changed before his words did. For half a second, the polished advisor vanished. The expensive calm, the smooth smile, the fatherly patience he wore in public, all of it slipped like a mask losing its string. Then he laughed. Not because anything was funny, because powerful men often laugh first when they feel the floor move beneath them. Your father? Victor said, looking Grace up and down. And who exactly was your father supposed to be? Grace held the cassette tape in her palm. It looked small there. Old plastic. Faded label. A thing from another time. But to her, it weighed more than the chandelier above them. More than every bottle of imported whiskey behind the bar. More than all the men at that table combined. My father was Detective Samuel Ellis, she said. The name moved through the room like a cold draft. A few older men shifted in their seats. Someone at the bar whispered, Ellis? Dante's eyes narrowed. He knew the name. Everyone from that era knew the name. Samuel Ellis had been the detective accused of taking bribes from 3 different crime families. His face had been printed on the front page under words like corrupt, disgraced, and dirty cop. 2 weeks later, he was gone. The official story was simple. Guilt had swallowed him. But Grace had never believed simple stories told by powerful people. Dante leaned forward slowly. Samuel Ellis investigated my brother's death. Grace nodded once. And he found something. Victor's jaw tightened. Dante saw it. Grace saw Dante see it. That small recognition gave her courage. My father tried to contact your family, Grace continued. He believed Luca Moretti didn't die in an accident. He believed someone close to him arranged it, then paid to have the investigation buried. The room was silent now, but not peaceful. It was the silence before a storm reaches the windows. Victor placed both hands on the table. This is absurd, he said. Dante, think. A maid walks in with an old tape, a dramatic story, and suddenly you're entertaining ghosts from 20 years ago. Grace flinched at the word maid. Not because it was her job. She was not ashamed of honest work. She flinched because of how he used it, like a cage, like a verdict, like the lowest thing a person could be. Dante noticed, and something in his eyes hardened. Careful, Victor, he said quietly. Victor turned to him. Careful? With her? No, Dante said. With me. The words sank into the marble. Grace swallowed, then set the cassette tape on the table between the whiskey glass and Victor's untouched cigar. My father hid this before he died. I found it 3 weeks ago. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know who to trust. And yet you trusted me? Dante asked. Grace looked at the whiskey glass. No, Mr. Moretti, she said. I trusted what my father died trying to protect. For the first time that night, Dante's expression shifted. Not much. Just enough. A crack in the stone. His brother's name had always lived inside him like a locked room. Luca Moretti had been 28, reckless, charming, and too kind for the family he was born into. The night he died, Dante had been told there was nothing anyone could have done. A wet road. A failed brake line. A tragedy. But Dante had never forgotten Victor's hand on his shoulder at the funeral, guiding him away from the coffin, whispering, some truths only make grief worse. Now, all these years later, a woman everyone ignored had placed that truth back in front of him. Dante lifted one hand. The bodyguard near the wall stepped forward. Bring the old deck from my office, Dante said. Now. Victor's eyes flashed. You're actually going to play it? Here. Dante turned his face toward him. Yes. Victor laughed again, but this time there was no sound of power in it. Only fear pretending to stand tall. Dante, this is beneath you. Dante looked at Grace, then at the broken glass still glittering on the floor beside her shoes. No, he said. What happened to her father was beneath us. The bodyguard returned with a small cassette player, black and scratched, the kind no one had used in years. Dante placed the tape inside himself. His thumb hovered over the button. Across the table, Victor stopped breathing evenly. Grace closed her hands together so tightly her knuckles ached. Dante pressed play. A hiss filled the speakers. Then a man's voice emerged from the past. Tired. Low. Unmistakably afraid. My name is Detective Samuel Ellis. If this tape reaches Dante Moretti, then I am already out of time. The whole bar went still. The tape hissed like an old wound. Reopening. For several seconds, no one moved. Not the bartender with his hands still frozen around a bottle. Not the pianist, whose fingers hovered above the keys. Not the men at Dante's table. Men who had survived raids, betrayals, prison threats, and funerals without blinking. Because the dead had just spoken. My name is Detective Samuel Ellis. The voice repeated through the small cassette player. If this tape reaches Dante Moretti, then I am already out of time. Grace felt the room tilt. She had listened to that voice alone in her apartment, sitting on the edge of her bed while rain tapped against the window and the city moved on without her. She had pressed a towel to her mouth so the neighbors would not hear her cry. But hearing it here, in front of Dante, in front of Victor, in front of the very men who once let her father's name be dragged through mud, was different. Here, the truth had witnesses. The tape crackled. I was assigned to review the death of Luca Moretti after the official report closed the case as an accident. But the brake line was not worn down. It was cut, clean, deliberate. A murmur passed through the bar. Dante did not move. Only his jaw tightened. Grace watched him carefully. For the first time, she understood that power did not protect a man from grief. It only taught him how to hide it better. The tape continued. I found payments routed through 3 shell companies. The final account connected to a man inside the Moretti circle. Someone with enough access to Luca's car, his schedule, and his security rotation. Victor smiled faintly. It was a terrible smile. The kind a man wears when he knows the truth is near, but believes it still cannot touch him. Dante's eyes remained on the cassette player. "Say the name," he whispered, as if the dead man could hear him. A short burst of static filled the speakers. Then Samuel Ellis's voice returned, lower now. "The name I have is Victor Hale." The room did not simply go quiet. It emptied of sound. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Victor's smile died. Grace felt her knees weaken, but she stayed standing. She had waited 10 years to hear her father believed by someone other than herself. Dante turned his head slowly toward Victor. No rage crossed his face. That was worse. Rage would have made him human. This was colder, cleaner, the kind of calm that arrived after a door closed forever. Victor lifted a hand. "Dante," he said carefully, "you know how easy tapes can be altered. You know what desperate people will do for money." Grace looked down. There it was. The old weapon. Discredit the dead. Shame the poor. Make truth look like hunger. Victor pointed at her. "She works here for tips. You think she didn't know what kind of reward this might bring? Her father was exposed as dirty years ago. This is not justice. This is revenge dressed up as grief." Grace's throat tightened. For one painful second, she was 16 again, standing outside a courthouse while reporters shouted questions about her father. Her mother had squeezed her hand until it hurt, whispering, "Keep walking, baby. Don't let them see you break." So Grace did not break now. She raised her eyes. "My father never took bribes," she said. "He took evidence. And because he would not sell it, men like you made sure nobody would listen." Victor slammed his palm on the table. "You watch your mouth." Dante stood. The chair behind him moved back with a soft scrape. That tiny sound was enough to make every man in the bar straighten. Dante stepped between Victor and Grace. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a wall being built. "You don't speak to her like that again," he said. Victor stared at him, stunned. Dante reached into his jacket and removed the folded warning note. He placed it beside the cassette player. "This woman had every reason to stay silent," Dante said. "She could have let me drink. She could have let you win. Instead, she risked her life to put 7 words under my glass." He looked around the bar, at the men who had laughed, at the wealthy guests who had watched her humiliation as entertainment, at the staff who had learned, like Grace, that survival often meant lowering your head. Then Dante looked back at Victor. "And you called her beneath us." Victor's face had gone pale. Dante picked up the whiskey glass. The same glass Grace had warned him not to drink. He held it under the light, watching the amber liquid glow like polished gold. Then he set it in front of Victor. "Drink it," Dante said. Victor froze. And Grace knew. So did everyone else. The warning note had not just saved Dante Moretti. It had exposed the poison already sitting at his table. Victor Hale stared at the whiskey glass as if it had grown teeth. The amber liquid sat between him and Dante, glowing beneath the chandelier, still and innocent looking. Around them, the Black Saint had become so silent that Grace could hear the faint hum of the lights above the bar. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The same men who had chuckled when Victor mocked her were suddenly studying the floor, their napkins, their rings, anything but the glass. Dante's hand rested on the back of Victor's chair. "Drink it," he repeated. Victor swallowed. A bead of sweat slid down the side of his face, disappearing into the collar of his expensive shirt. "You're being theatrical," Victor said, trying to recover the smoothness in his voice. "This is exactly what she wants. She wants to turn you against me." Grace stood behind Dante, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. She wanted to speak, but Dante did not need her to. Not yet. He leaned closer to Victor. "If there is nothing wrong with that glass," Dante said, "then drink." Victor looked around the table, searching for help. But every man who had once laughed at his jokes now looked away. Power was loyal only when it believed you were winning. And Victor Hale was no longer winning. The cassette player continued to hiss softly. Detective Samuel Ellis's voice had stopped, but the weight of his words still filled the room. Grace stared at the tape. For 10 years, her father had been a ghost in every room she entered. A name people avoided. A photograph her mother could not look at for too long. A truth buried so deep that even hope had grown tired of digging. But tonight, in the basement of a hotel owned by the kind of men her father had investigated, that truth was sitting on a table in plain sight. Dante turned slightly. Marco, he said. One of his guards stepped forward. Take the glass to Dr. Bell. Quietly. I want the contents tested. Victor's face tightened. There's no need for that. Dante looked at him. That's what guilty men always say when evidence leaves the room. Marco lifted the whiskey glass carefully with a white napkin and carried it toward the back exit. Victor rose from his chair. 2 guards moved at once, blocking him without touching him. That made the fear on his face worse. Grace saw it clearly now. The great Victor Hale, the man who had mocked her shoes, her job, her life, was afraid of a maid, a dead detective, and a glass he would not drink. Dante reached toward Victor's hand. Victor tried to pull away, but Dante caught his wrist and held it steady beneath the light. The ring gleamed on his finger. Gold. Heavy. Old. Dante's voice dropped. That ring belonged to Luca. Victor said nothing. Dante slowly twisted it free. The room watched. Grace watched. Even the pianist, still frozen at his bench, watched as Dante placed the ring beside the warning note. My brother wore this the night he died, Dante said. It was not recovered from the scene. Victor's lips parted, but no words came. Dante's eyes stayed on him. So I will ask you once, he said. Not as your boss. Not as your friend. As Luca's brother. The silence sharpened. Where did you get it? Victor's face trembled with the effort of holding itself together. Then came the sound that broke him. A phone ringing. Marco returned from the hallway, holding his cell against his ear. He listened for 3 seconds, then looked at Dante. His voice was low. The drink was contaminated. A woman near the bar gasped. Victor closed his eyes. And in that tiny surrender, the whole room understood. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. Dante did not shout. He did not strike. He simply stepped back, as if Victor had become something unclean. You sat beside me, Dante said, wearing my brother's ring, with poison in my glass. Victor's mouth moved, but whatever excuse he had prepared died before it reached the room. Dante looked at his guards. Take him downstairs. Victor turned toward the crowd, desperate now. She's lying, he shouted, pointing at Grace. Her father was dirty. She's nothing. Dante's voice cut through him. No, one word. Enough to stop everything. Dante picked up the cassette tape and held it high enough for the room to see. Her father was the only clean man in a room full of cowards. Grace's eyes filled before she could stop them. For the first time in 10 years, no one laughed at her father's name. No one spat on it. No one lowered their voice like it was something shameful. Dante turned to Grace, and in front of everyone, he bowed his head. Detective Ellis saved my brother's honor, he said. And tonight, his daughter saved my life. The whole bar went silent again. But this time, the silence did not belong to fear. It belonged to respect. Victor Hale did not fight when the guards took him. That was what Grace remembered most. Not his shouting. Not his accusations. Not the way his expensive shoes scraped against the marble as 2 men guided him toward the private elevator. It was the moment his shoulders dropped. The moment he understood that the room no longer belonged to him. For years, Victor had survived by controlling stories. He had turned murder into accident, loyalty into weakness, honesty into disgrace. He had buried Samuel Ellis beneath newspaper headlines and courtroom whispers. He had worn Luca Moretti's ring like a trophy in rooms where no one dared ask questions. But tonight, one maid had asked. Not loudly, not with power, with a folded note beneath a whiskey glass. The elevator doors closed behind Victor. A soft metallic sound. Final. Grace stood near Dante's table, unable to move. Around her, the Black Saint remained frozen in a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. Men who had once filled the room with loud confidence now looked small beneath the chandelier. The bartender lowered his eyes. The woman in pearls at the corner table wiped at her cheek. One of the older men near the bar slowly stood, removed his hat, and held it against his chest. Grace did not understand at first. Then another man stood. Then another. One by one, the room rose. Not for Dante Moretti. For Detective Samuel Ellis. Grace's father. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. 10 years of shame. 10 years of swallowed anger. 10 years of hearing her father's name spoken like dirt. All of it pressed against her chest until breathing felt impossible. Dante turned toward her. His voice was quieter now. Your father came to my family with the truth, he said. And we failed him. Grace shook her head, but he raised one hand. No. Let me say it. The room listened. Dante picked up the cassette tape and placed it carefully beside Luca's ring. My brother was killed because he trusted the wrong man. Your father died because he tried to expose him. And tonight, you walked into a room full of men who could hurt you, and you still chose truth. Grace's eyes burned. I was scared, she whispered. Dante looked at her with something almost gentle. Courage usually is. Those words broke something in her. Not in a weak way. In the way ice breaks when spring finally reaches it. She covered her mouth with one trembling hand, but the tears came anyway. Silent tears. Proud tears. The kind she had never allowed herself in public because the world had already taken too much from her family. Dante reached into his jacket and removed his phone. He called someone, but his eyes never left Grace. Get every paper that printed Samuel Ellis's name, he said. Every editor. Every judge who signed off on that report. Every man who helped bury it. By morning, I want the city to know the truth. He paused, then added, colder, and I want his badge returned to his daughter. Grace froze. My father's badge? Dante nodded. It belongs with you. For a moment, she was 16 again, standing beside her mother in a black dress, watching strangers turn away from them at the funeral. No salute. No honor. No folded flag. Just silence and shame. But this silence was different. This silence was listening. Dante stepped aside and faced the room. Look at her, he said. No one dared disobey. Every eye turned to Grace. Some ashamed. Some humbled. Some unable to meet her gaze for more than a second. This is the woman you laughed at, Dante said. The woman you called beneath you. The woman who cleaned your tables while carrying a truth none of you were brave enough to face. Grace stood straighter. Her uniform was still plain. Her shoes were still worn. Her hands still smelled of lemon soap and whiskey. But she no longer felt invisible. Dante picked up the folded warning note and placed it gently in her hand. You saved my life, he said. Grace closed her fingers around the paper. No, she replied softly. My father did. I just made sure you finally heard him. The room went still again. And this time, no one looked away. By sunrise, the city began to remember Samuel Ellis. It started quietly. A phone call to a newspaper editor who had once built his career on calling Samuel a dirty cop. Then another call to a retired judge whose signature sat at the bottom of the false report. Then a call to a police commissioner who had pretended, for 10 years, that the case was closed because reopening it would embarrass too many powerful men. By 8 in the morning, their phones would not stop ringing. By 9, old files were pulled from locked cabinets. By 10, men who had slept comfortably for a decade began sweating through expensive shirts. But Grace Ellis knew none of that yet. She sat alone in the empty bar after everyone had gone, hands folded around a cup of coffee she had not touched. The Black Saint looked different without the crowd. Smaller. Colder. The golden lights had been dimmed. Chairs sat upside down on polished tables. The marble floor had been cleaned until no trace of broken glass remained. But Grace could still see it. The shattered crystal de Victor's pale face. Dante holding up the tape that a room full of people rising for her father. She had dreamed of that moment so many times that now, after it had happened, she did not know what to do with her hands. Dante stood near the bar, speaking softly with Marco. His jacket was gone. His sleeves were rolled up. For the first time, he looked less like a man carved from power and more like someone who had not slept. Grace watched him from the corner of her eye. She still feared him. A wise woman would. But fear was no longer the only thing in the room. There was something else now. Recognition. Dante ended the conversation and walked toward her, carrying a small black box. Grace sat straighter. What is that? She asked. He placed it on the table in front of her. No ceremony, no speech. Just the box. I had someone retrieve it from evidence storage, Dante said. It should never have been there. Grace stared at the box. Her fingers did not move. She already knew. Some things are recognized before they are opened. Dante lowered his voice. You don't have to look at it here. Grace shook her head. Yes, she whispered. I do. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay her father's badge, tarnished at the edges, scratched across the face, but still whole. Detective Samuel Ellis. For a moment, Grace could not breathe. The room blurred. She saw her father at the kitchen table, polishing that badge before work. She saw him kneeling to tie her shoes when she was little. She heard him telling her that dignity was not something people gave you when they felt generous. It's something you stand in, he had said, tapping 2 fingers over her heart. even when the world tries to make you kneel. Grace touched the badge with one fingertip. Then she broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just one hand over her mouth, one hand on the table, tears falling onto the black velvet lining. Dante looked away, giving her the privacy the room never had. "I'm sorry," he said. Grace wiped her face, but more tears came. "For what?" "For believing the story that was easiest for my family to survive." That answer hurt because it was honest. Grace closed the box gently. "My father knew the risk," she said. "He always said truth had a cost." Dante's eyes lowered to the badge. "And what did it cost you?" Grace almost laughed, but it came out broken. "My mother cleaned offices until her hands swelled. I dropped out of college. People crossed the street when they saw us. At church, women who used to bring casseroles stopped meeting my eyes." She paused. The worst part wasn't being poor. It was watching people treat my father's name like it could stain them. Dante stood very still. For once, he had no command ready. No threat. No solution large enough to cover what had been stolen. Grace looked up at him. "But last night," she said. "When they stood," her voice caught. Dante finished quietly. "They stood too late." "Yes," Grace said. "But they stood." Morning light began slipping through the narrow windows near the ceiling, pale and silver across the empty bar. Dante took the folded warning note from his pocket. He had kept it after all. "I want you protected," he said. Grace's eyes sharpened. "I don't want to belong to anyone's cage, Mr. Moretti." A faint shadow crossed his face. "Respect, not offense." "Then not a cage," he said. "A choice. You decide what help looks like." Grace studied him. The most dangerous man in the city had just learned the difference between protection and control. She picked up her father's badge and held it against her chest. "For now," she said, "help me clear his name the right way." Dante nodded once. "Then we do it the right way." And in the quiet of that ruined, holy morning, the maid and the Mafia boss made a promise over a tarnished badge. The truth would no longer whisper. It would walk into daylight. By noon, Samuel Ellis's name was back on every screen in the city. Not as a scandal, not as a warning, as a question people were finally afraid to ignore. Was Detective Samuel Ellis framed? Grace stood inside Dante Moretti's private office, staring at the television mounted above the fireplace. Her father's old photograph filled the screen, younger, proud, wearing the same badge that now rested in the black box beside her hand. A news anchor spoke carefully, the way people speak when they know lawyers are listening. New evidence suggests Detective Ellis may have been falsely accused in connection with the corruption case that ended his career 10 years ago. Grace's throat tightened. Falsely accused. 2 words. So small. So late. And yet they landed inside her like sunlight through a locked door. Dante stood near the window, phone in hand, his reflection dark against the glass. Behind him, the city moved as if nothing sacred had happened. Cars rushed. People crossed streets. The world kept walking over old graves unless someone forced it to stop. Grace turned down the volume. "I don't want them to make him a headline," she said. Dante looked back at her. "They already did that once." Grace's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "I want them to say his name like he was a man. Not a case. Not a mistake. A man." Dante nodded. "Then they will." Before Grace could answer, the office door opened. Marco stepped in. "The commissioner is downstairs." Grace went still. Dante's eyes hardened. "Bring him up." 5 minutes later, Commissioner Harold Price entered the office. He was older than Grace remembered from the news, heavier around the face, his expensive suit pulled tight at the buttons. But his eyes were the same, careful, political, always measuring which truth was safest. He looked at Dante first, then at Grace. For a second, she saw recognition. Not of her face, of her father's. "Miss Ellis," he said. Grace did not respond. The commissioner cleared his throat. "I want to express my deepest regret for what your family endured." Regret. Grace almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because people with power loved soft words. Regret. Misunderstanding. Oversight. Tragedy. Words that sounded clean enough to hide dirty hands. "My mother died with your department still calling my father corrupt," Grace said quietly. "Did you regret it then?" The commissioner's face tightened. Dante said nothing. He did not save the man from her question. That mattered. Price looked down. "The department relied on information we now understand was compromised." Grace stepped closer to the desk and opened the black box. Her father's badge caught the light. No, she said. You relied on silence. There's a difference. The room became very still. Commissioner Price swallowed. Grace lifted the badge with both hands. This belonged to Detective Samuel Ellis. You let it sit in evidence storage like stolen property. You let his name rot because correcting the truth would have embarrassed powerful men. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. My father was not perfect, but he was honest. And when honesty became inconvenient, you buried him. Price looked at Dante, perhaps hoping for rescue. Dante's face was unreadable. Don't look at me, Dante said. Answer her. The commissioner turned back to Grace. For the first time, he seemed smaller than his title. You're right, he said. Grace's breath caught. Price reached into his coat and removed a folded document. This is an official statement from the department. Detective Samuel Ellis will be fully cleared. His service record will be restored. His badge number will be retired with honor. Grace looked at the paper but did not take it. Say it, she whispered. The commissioner hesitated. Grace's eyes sharpened. Not on paper. Not through a spokesperson. Say it to me. Price stood straighter, shame coloring his face. Detective Samuel Ellis was innocent, he said. He was framed, and the department failed him. The words filled the office. Grace closed her eyes. For 10 years, she had imagined anger would be the thing that carried her when this moment came. But it was not anger. It was grief. Clean, deep grief. The kind that finally had room to breathe. When she opened her eyes, Dante was watching her, not with pity, but with respect. Grace took the statement at last. Then she looked at the commissioner. You won't just apologize to me, she said. You'll say it where the city can hear. Price nodded slowly. By sunset, cameras gathered outside the precinct. And when Commissioner Price stepped to the microphones and spoke Samuel Ellis's name with honor, Grace stood in the crowd holding her father's badge against her heart. No uniform, no title, no powerful last name. Just a daughter who had carried the truth until the world was forced to carry it with her. And behind her, silent beneath the flashing lights, Dante Moretti watched the city bow its head too late. 3 days later, Grace Ellis returned to the Black Saint. Not as a maid, not as a shadow moving between tables, as the daughter of Detective Samuel Ellis. The bar had reopened, but it no longer felt the same. The amber lights still glowed against the dark wood. The marble floor still reflected the chandelier. The glasses still shone behind the counter like rows of captured stars. But the laughter was quieter now. Careful, respectful. Men who had once spoken over waitresses now said thank you. Guests who used to look through the staff now moved aside when Grace entered. It should have satisfied her. It didn't. Respect born from fear was not the same as respect born from understanding. Grace knew the difference. She walked to the center table, the same table where Dante had almost lifted poisoned whiskey to his lips. The same table where Victor Hale had smiled with her father's truth buried under his ring. Now, on that table, Dante had placed a framed photograph. Detective Samuel Ellis in uniform. Below it, a small brass plate read, Samuel Ellis, a man who chose truth when silence was safer. Grace stopped. For a moment, she could not speak. Dante stood beside the table in a black suit, hands folded in front of him. Around the room, the staff gathered quietly. The bartender, the waitresses, the cooks from the kitchen, even the young busboy who always looked terrified of making mistakes. No senators, no judges, no men with bloodless smiles. Just the people who kept the place alive after powerful men left their mess behind. Dante looked at Grace. I thought this room needed to remember the right name, he said. Grace touched the edge of the frame. My father would have hated all this attention. A faint smile crossed Dante's face. Then he raised a daughter just like him. Grace looked down, swallowing the ache in her throat. On the wall behind the bar, where old bottles of rare whiskey had once been displayed, Dante had cleared a space. There hung a second frame, not a photograph, but a piece of paper. Her warning note. 7 words in her handwriting. Don't drink. The man beside you killed your brother. Grace stared at it. That was supposed to disappear, she whispered. No, Dante said. That was the first honest thing this room had heard in years. The staff stood in silence. But this silence was different from the one Victor had left behind. This silence held no fear. It held witness. Dante turned to everyone in the room. From this day forward, no one who works here is invisible, he said. Not to me. Not to the guests. Not to anyone. If a man cannot respect the person serving his table, he doesn't deserve a seat at it. The bartender lowered his head. One waitress began to cry quietly. Grace looked at their faces and realized something she had not expected. Her father's name had not only been restored for her. It had opened a door for every person in that room who had ever swallowed disrespect because rent was due, because children needed food, because survival demanded silence. Dante stepped aside. "This bar is yours to manage, if you want it," he said. Grace turned sharply. "What?" "You know what happens in rooms like this better than anyone. You see what others miss. You hear what powerful men think no one hears." He paused. "But only if you choose it. No debt. No cage." Grace studied him for a long moment. The Mafia boss who had once ruled through silence was learning to ask instead of take. That mattered. She looked at her father's photograph, then at the staff, then at the warning note behind the glass. "I'll manage it," she said. "But not as your symbol." Dante nodded. "As Grace Ellis." She lifted her chin. "And the first rule is simple. Everyone enters through the same door. No one gets to treat kindness like weakness in my house." A quiet smile moved through the staff. Dante looked around the bar once more. For years, the Black Saint had been a place where secrets came to hide. Now, because of a maid with trembling hands and a dead man's truth, it had become the place where silence finally learned to kneel. Grace picked up her father's badge from the table and pinned it inside her jacket, close to her heart. Then she walked behind the bar, not to serve powerful men, but to stand where everyone could see her. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.